The presidents of Russia and China hold a virtual meeting. What was on the agenda? Hello, I'm Arlen Gnider, and this is The Heat. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a video summit meeting on Wednesday. The two leaders discussed a range of major issues, including their countries' close bilateral ties, security, and trade. We begin with this report from Wang Hui in Beijing.
The virtual meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin has become another boost towards the two countries' bilateral ties. The two leaders evaluated the achievements made over time, with Xi pointing out the achievements made in trade, cooperation in technological innovation, and the Belt and Road Initiative. Xi said he is willing to cooperate together in various areas to facilitate the development of ties. Putin said China-Russia relations over the past year are highlighted by the 20th anniversary of the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and friendly cooperation, with both parties agreeing to prolong the treaty by another 5 years. Putin also confirmed he will attend the opening ceremony of Beijing Winter Olympics on February 4th. This comes after America's recent announcement they will not send governmental representatives or diplomats to the event.
Next February, I expect we can finally meet in person in Beijing, as we have agreed. We will hold talks and then participate in the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympic Games.
Xi welcomes Putin's visit.
I'm very much looking forward to our personal meeting at the Winter Olympics. I'm willing to join hands with you in the future and work together to write a new chapter in Sino-Russian relations in the post-pandemic era.
Xi mentioned, although the world has undergone turmoil and transformation, China-Russia ties have shown new vitality and energy. Also noting that the two countries should unify the world to fight against the pandemic and demonstrate the true meaning of democracy and human rights. Xi pointed out at the meeting that China and Russia should demonstrate the responsibility they have as major powers, shown through practicing real multilateralism and maintaining international fairness and justice. Wang Hui, CGTN, Beijing.
To discuss all of this, joining me now from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Also with us here in Washington is Anton Fedyashin. He is a Russian expert and a professor of history at American University. With us too from Dallas is Josef Gregory Mahoney. He is professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University in Shanghai. And from Dubai, we're joined by Remi Piet. He is a commentator on European politics. Welcome to all of you to the show. Victor Gao, let's start with you. These two men have met more than 36 times. In fact, this year alone, they've met twice. So put this in perspective for us. Why is this relationship so important right now, coming at a time when both these countries find themselves being the target of increasing hostility from the West?
Thank you very much for having me. Indeed, you are absolutely right. President Putin, President Xi Jinping of China have met many times, and China-Russian relations are very normal, very good, and they are very strategic in nature. Now, this virtual meeting took place at a time very interesting because every one of us knows that President Putin will come to Beijing to attend the Winter Olympics in Beijing at the beginning of February. And so just before the physical meeting, this virtual meeting took place. Now, you may know recently there have been virtual meetings between President Biden of the United States and President Xi Jinping of China. And there was also a virtual meeting between President Biden and President Putin not far ago. And several months ago, President Biden of the United States and President Putin of Russia met in Switzerland. So you may be well impressed by this flurry of diplomatic activities involving China, Russia, and the United States. This demonstrates that the trilateral relations involving the United States, China, and Russia are a very important feature in current day international relations. And while the U.S. is facing very deteriorating relations with China on the one hand and with Russia on the other hand, China-Russian relations are not only normal, not only constructive, they are also improving very rapidly. So we are talking about two sides of the trilateral relations, that is, between China and Russia, being reinforced and become more and more strategic, whereas the United States is very much just the one lateral in this trilateral relations. I would say this has tremendous, profound strategic implications. This also means whatever the United States wants to do unilaterally in this trilateral relations against China or against Russia, or sometimes against both China and and Russia, cannot be a success strategically going forward.
Anton Fedyashin, how do you see this meeting coming at a time when Russia is under increasing pressure from the United States over Ukraine?
Well, for Russia, this, in a sense, is a reaffirmation of the close relationship with China. There's a reason why Henry Kissinger has been one of the more vocal critics of American foreign policy towards Russia, because he's seeing in his late years the brilliant work that he and Nixon had done in the 1970s being undone right before his eyes. They brought Washington and Beijing closer to each other than either of them was to Moscow, and now the exact opposite is happening with spectacular American encouragement. That's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that there's a profound tectonic geopolitical shift going on in the world. As an historian, not a political scientist, I tend to look at these things in the broader historical perspective. With the Columbian era, the beginning of the exploration of the world by the Europeans, it really has been the West that has been setting the trend for global affairs. This is not to say that things did not happen elsewhere. They certainly did. But things that happened in Australia or in Latin America didn't affect Eurasia and the rest of the world. But things that happened in Europe for good and bad certainly did affect the rest of the planet. We're living now through the era of the de-Westernization of the world, and globalization, which I'm sure will continue, will no longer unfold to the beat and at the direction of the West. New actors are coming out, and Russia and China are part of them. So these are profoundly important processes, and as all transition periods, things are very unstable, and it's very difficult to predict exactly where they're going to go. But it looks like Moscow and Beijing are trying to do their best to stay on top of that wave.
Anton, as you say, for a long time the West decided trends in the world, but and now, as you point out as well, there are tectonic shifts in international relations, in geostrategic relations. But do you think there is a recognition on the part of the United States that these changes are taking place?
Yes, there is, but it comes in two seemingly contradictory ways. On the one hand, there is the recognition of the relative decline of American power, by which I most certainly do not mean any kind of impending collapse. All of that is silliness, but a relative decline, a relative decline in influence of the United States. That the Americans are beginning to recognize. On the other hand, what we also see, especially with the Summit of Democracies that just came and went, and did not, by the way, attract terribly much attention, the United States is returning and trying to impose on the world something that's been historically, again, for good and for bad, an American tradition, which is a binary vision of the world, this tendency to break things down into twos, to attach value to them and judge them, and thereby try to sort of rule over its own followers. So what the U.S. seems to be trying to do is to divide the world into two new camps, one being the democratic one, in which it is the undisputed hegemon, and then there's everyone else. The U.S. is making peace slowly and painfully with the fact that it cannot do what it did in the 90s and 2000s. The unipolar moment is over, and therefore it's creating a sphere of influence for itself, and then it will try to balance out the rest of the world. We'll see if the U.S. is successful in that or not.
Joseph, Gregory, Mahoney, President Xi also met with President Biden recently, and of course last week there was that meeting between President Biden and the Russian President Vladimir Putin. What do you read into this latest meeting between Presidents Putin and President Xi Jinping and the message that that sends to the United States?
Well, you know, I actually published a short article on the Biden-Putin meeting, and the title was "The Biden-Putin Duet is a Flop." My sense is that you know, there is this desire in Washington to try to split actually Russia from China. I think that there's I think what's happening with the Ukraine pressure, they're trying to find the right mix of cost and benefits to entice Putin into more the Western sphere. And there was this brief moment after the meeting when Putin said that he would present some counter proposals, but then we've seen this very strong meeting in the wake of that announcement between Putin and Xi, and some very, very strong statements coming out of this, like standing firm and rejecting Western interference, defending each other's security interests, a new model of cooperation based on principle of non-interference in internal affairs, respect for each other's interests. You know, the announcement that bilateral trade for the first 11 months of this year was up 123 billion, and their goal was to exceed 200 billion in the near future. There were a lot of positive things noted that I think clearly signals the political reality, which is China and Russia's interest align on many fronts: economic, geostrategic, and increasingly cultural. If you are familiar with the growing number of Russians in China, there's a tremendous amount of positive exchange going on, and I think that the meeting that we saw today is a reflection of that.
Remi, Piet, there are those who argue that it's a very hardline approach by the Biden administration towards both Russia and China that is driving these two countries together. I mean, do you believe that to be the case, or was it perhaps inevitable that these two countries would seek stronger ties, in the years ahead?
Well, I very strongly agree with the other panelists that mentioned, the importance of those ties, whether on the cultural, economic, political, geostrategic levels. There's plenty of reasons why, Russia and China has plenty to gain to work more with each other. I mean, especially in terms of potential joint investment into energy, into infrastructure, the need for Russia to actually, bridge the technological gap that has been, increased by the sanctions from the West. Definitely, there's potentially here a difference between the European perspective and the American perspective. The Europeans are, for different, obvious geographical reasons, more concerned by the assertiveness of Vladimir Putin at the frontier of Ukraine, especially. They do have concerns regarding China in terms of the systemic rivals, especially for the lack of reciprocity for investment here. But Europe is not part of a series of alliance, whether Quad or AUKUS. We've seen AUKUS with Australia. We've seen the deal between the Americans, the British, and Australian on nuclear-powered submarines, while the French was suggesting weapon deals that did not, lead to nuclear proliferation. There's really a cautious about trying not to increase a threat to the very existence or very security of the two powers, and then for not, provide new reasons for, more assertiveness or more feeling of being pressured with different countries surrounding China and Russia, allying their interests and potentially ramping up their military activity. And so definitely, this hawkish position from Washington as for different reasons, creating more of a perception of threats from China and Russia, and more reasons to step up their collaboration also on the military level.
Victor Gao, President Xi, in fact, has been very critical of those whom he says interfere in the internal affairs of Russia and China on the pretext of human rights and democracy. But if we look at United States policy and United States strategy, the United States appears to want to continue this kind of policy. What are the risks in that?
Well, first of all, I think human rights should start at home, as charity starts at home. And the United States should really prove its own human rights record and demonstrate to the world what are the deficiencies in its own record, not only in terms of human rights, in terms of discrimination against Afro-Americans or other minority groups in the United States, but also in terms of democracy. The United States does not have a perfect record on democracy. No country has a perfect record, philosophically speaking. So in terms of democracy, human rights, rule of law, etc., all the countries have a stake, and everyone should participate in the discussions of such important matters of universal value to everyone. Now, if the United States wants to say, I have a perfect record, I have the monopoly of truth in terms of human rights or democracy or rule of law, it will not work, because it cannot fool the other countries in the world. It cannot fool altogether more than 7 billion people. Every country, every people have their own eyes. They are independent in their own judgment. So when we talk about human rights and democracy, be humble first. Come to such discussions with humility and deal with all the countries with respect, rather than preaching to other countries and lecturing to other countries. That will not work. Every country has its own circumstances. China has its own challenges. Russia has its own challenges. But when we talk about the United States, look at the investigation of January the 6th, seizure of the Capitol Hill. Look at the difficulties encountered in the investigation. Look at what former President Trump still talks about. His election victory was stolen, for example. So, human rights starting at home for the United States, and then we will have a better way to deal with human rights universally throughout the world.
The point is, Victor, is that the United States is determined to continue on this track. How counterproductive is it going to be?
Thank you. It's absolutely counterproductive. Why? Because it will further expose the hypocrisy and the double standards on the United States. And then it will also reinforce the views in China, at least, and very likely in Russia, that the United States is using human rights as a weapon, as an instrument in achieving its own geopolitical games against these countries. And then they will create more incentive for China and Russia to get closer to each other, because these two countries not only share a common border of 7,400 kilometers, they also share a lot of common interests together. And they are faced with the common challenge of the United States weaponizing human rights and rule of law and democracy issues. And they need to get together closer. And China now calls China-Russia relations as not an alliance, but better than alliance. What does that mean? I hope the American decision makers in Washington will really think very carefully about this ever-reinforcing strategic relations between China and relation. Better than alliance, stronger than alliance. What does this mean to the Americans?
Anton, Fedyashin, both China and Russia have very strong economic and trade ties. In fact, trade, if we look at trade in the first 3 months of 2021, it was worth over $100 billion. How important is this economic and trade relationship for Russia, and do you expect it to grow even further?
It's very important, Anand. The figure that was actually quoted today during the meeting was 123 billion as of November 21. Those were Putin's figures. I actually looked to compare that figure to Russia's trade turnover with the EU as of November, and that stands at $171 billion. Now, this is a little bit more than China, but it's significantly less than the trade turnover that Russia was doing with Europe before the Ukraine crisis and the pandemic started. And that was around 400 billion. China is very quickly catching up with the trade turnover that Russia had with Europe. The trade turnover between Russia and the U.S. is at 27 billion. I checked that today, which is meager compared to Russia's economic relationship with Europe and China. So China is gaining very fast. China is a very important partner for Russia in terms of finished goods and technology for capital investment. The Russians having been placed under sanctions. So I expect that to grow. I fully expect the turnover to reach 200 billion. I don't think that's out of the question. But there is there are things to be cautious about for the Russians. If you look at the nature of the trading relationship, most of what Russia exports to China are energy commodities, timber, and agricultural products. What comes from China is more value-added stuff, so technology. So this is not a good position for any country to be in, and I'm sure they will figure out how to right that balance. And last thing I'll say is the other concern, not even concern, but the question for me is that, yes, Xi's relationship with Putin is very friendly, very strong. All of that is very good. But at what point will Russia-China move from this partnership of convenience to a thoroughly institutionalized relationship? I think that the economic angle will be the basis for building on all of that.
Joseph, Anton was telling us a moment ago about the huge tectonic shifts, he called it, that are taking place right now in geopolitical relationships, in the balance of power around the world. Is this growing relationship between China and Russia an indication of a changing world where United States influence is in fact no longer what it was?
I think that's absolutely the case. I think again, this is a subject that I've been discussing in other media. One of the big shifts that we saw from the U.S. in the last few years, starting under Trump, was more or less breaking with Pakistan and embracing what had been a long time adversary of sorts in India. And we know that there's a difficult relationship between India and China. But in fact, if we really step back from that relationship, it's a relationship that could be mended, I think, with the right type of mediation and diplomacy. And this brings up an interesting point, because Russia has an extraordinarily positive relationship with India. And I think this is what's really starting to worry a lot of people in Washington, because if we can see some type of summit between New Delhi, Moscow, and Beijing, where differences are worked out, where long-term security guarantees, because that's what everyone really wants, are security guarantees, and fair trade. And I think that all three sides can work that out. Then that will really be game over for the U.S. and for any of the sort of second world nations that lack independent foreign policies and that have been riding in the American wake for all these years.
In fact, the two leaders, Joseph, they did raise the possibility of a three-way meeting taking place between Russia, China, and India. Remi, Piet, where do the Europeans fit into all of this? I mean, do they feel that they're caught in the middle of this sort of rivalry that we see between China, Russia, and the United States? I mean, how does Europe strike the balance here?
Well, Europe is trying to have a different approach probably to this. I mean, when you see from Washington potentially a vision of a unified front between Russia and China, there's really a different perspective from Brussels of dealing with Russia and China differently. Definitely the issue, I mean, you mentioned the issue of human rights, indeed is mentioned, but the biggest issue from the European Union is also on energy security, and that's an element that has to be put into the equation when you see the importance of the natural gas that is being exported out of Russia for European markets. Europe is actually very much dependent on the Russian exports of natural gas. We're seeing energy prices, especially increase over the last few months, and that is an element that is very important when you look at countries that are facing elections, that are facing a potential discontentment of their population among facing surging prices of energy. On the Chinese front, there are some different elements and views where you can still find some collaboration, and you've seen President Macron work very closely with Xi Jinping on issues on climate change specifically. There has been, as I was mentioning, a different approach to security matters in the region, trying not to antagonize further China on these elements. The main concern is to try to find a way to have a joint approach to a series of of concerns at the frontiers of Europe, whether you're talking about Belarus with the use of migrants to potentially play and kind of downplay the security of the European Union. As I was mentioning, Ukraine, that is always the hot topics for quite some years right now between the European and Russia. But you have maybe a possibility here for the European Union to be used as potentially a mediator between Washington and China and Russia if we were to move towards that direction. There is some clear indication from Beijing that there's attempts of having the European Union, being pulled away from a transatlantic relationship and potentially, build for strong ties in the future on a series of joint interest topics.
Right. Victor, we don't have too much time, but I want to get to this, and that is the confirmation by President Putin that he will be attending the Winter Olympics in Beijing. You talked about that earlier on. He is the first national leader, in fact, to confirm attendance at those games. How will that be seen, especially in the United States, which itself has said it's not sending any representatives or diplomats to it? It's been joined by some of its allies in Europe as well.
Thank you very much. I think President Putin's attendance of the Beijing Olympics will be very, very important, very well received by the Chinese government officials and Chinese people at large. And this is even more profound and significant at a time when the United States and its close allies are doing the so-called diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. Now, first of all, I'm very happy the United States and all the close allies of the United States are still sending their athletes to the Beijing Olympics. That's the only thing that matters. In the pandemic, the less people coming as government officials to the Beijing Olympics, the better, because our top priority is really to take care of the health and the quality of the competitions among the athletes. That's the top priority.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anton, very quickly, I've got about a minute left. We were talking a moment ago about the possibility of a three-way meeting, Russia, China and India. But how would you characterize the overall relationship between Russia and Asia?
It's developing and it's becoming much, much closer than it was in the 1990s, the early 2000s, when the Russians sort of rushed into the arms of the West, forgetting the fact that the bulk of their territory is in Asia. Remember that the United States started its pivot to Asia under Obama. Putin tried to do the same. It was slow going, but the Ukraine crisis galvanized and catalyzed exactly what should have happened much earlier. So the pivot to Asia is happening very fast. Putin was in India right before the meeting with Biden, and nothing's going to stop this process. Let me just add one more thing to what Victor said. I want to emphasize the importance of Putin's visit to the Chinese people specifically. Olympics are not only government events, they are also national events. And I think that the diplomatic boycott, although meant by the United States as a sign to the government, is really also received very negatively by the Chinese people.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anton. Thanks for watching.